The morning mist clung to the fjords like a ghostly shroud as Bjorn Ironside ran his calloused fingers along the edge of his sword. The blade sang a metallic whisper that had become as familiar to him as his own heartbeat. This wasn't just any ordinary piece of metal hammered into shape by some village blacksmith. This was a weapon forged by the gods themselves, or so the stories went, passed down through generations of warriors who had carved their names into the very fabric of history with blood and steel. Training with these weapons began in childhood, with young boys learning to handle wooden swords before they were old enough to lift the real thing. The techniques passed down through generations weren't just about swinging a blade. They were comprehensive fighting systems that incorporated footwork timing, distance management, and psychological warfare. A Viking warrior didn't just learn to use his weapons, he learned to think like his weapons, to become one with the steel that would either preserve his life or witness his death. The preservation conditions in Scandinavian bogs and burial sites have provided archaeologists with an unprecedented collection of Viking weapons in various states of preservation, from pristine examples that look as if they were forged yesterday to corroded fragments that still reveal crucial details about construction techniques. These archaeological treasures have allowed modern researchers to analyze Viking metallurgy using advanced scientific techniques that reveal secrets invisible to the naked eye, confirming what historical sources had long claimed about the superior quality of Norse weapons. The comparative analysis of Viking weapons against contemporary arms from other cultures reveals significant advantages in virtually every measurable category. The steel quality of Viking blades consistently shows higher carbon content, better homogeneity, and superior heat treatment compared to weapons from the same period found elsewhere in Europe. The construction techniques employed by Viking smiths produced weapons that were not only more effective in combat, but also more durable and reliable under the harsh conditions of medieval warfare. The experimental archaeology projects that have attempted to recreate Viking weapons using period-appropriate techniques have provided valuable insights into the skill levels required for their manufacture. Modern blacksmiths, even those with decades of experience, have found it extremely challenging to replicate the quality achieved by their Viking predecessors. The pattern welding technique in particular has proven to be far more complex and demanding than initially understood, requiring not just technical skill, but also an intuitive understanding of steel behavior that could only be developed through years of dedicated practice. The metallurgical analysis of Viking weapon fragments has revealed sophisticated alloying techniques that weren't formally understood by European science until centuries later. The deliberate addition of specific trace elements to improve steel properties, the careful control of phosphorus and sulfur content, and the use of specialized heat treatment cycles demonstrate a level of metallurgical sophistication that rivals modern industrial processes. These techniques weren't the result of scientific theory, but rather empirical knowledge accumulated through generations of trial and error. The wear patterns found on excavated Viking weapons provide fascinating insights into how they were actually used in combat. The distribution of nicks, scratches, and edge damage reveals fighting techniques and tactical applications that complement the written sources describing Viking warfare. Some weapons show evidence of having been used for multiple purposes beyond combat, serving as tools for everyday tasks when not needed for fighting, which speaks to their durability and versatility. The geographic distribution of high-quality Viking weapons across Europe traces the paths of Norse expansion and influence, with superior weapons found in locations far from their original manufacturing centers. The presence of Viking weapons in graves and hoards from Ireland to Russia demonstrates not only the extent of Norse military activities, but also the high regard in which these weapons were held by non-Scandinavian peoples who acquired them through trade, tribute, or conquest. The technological transfer that occurred as Viking weapon-making techniques spread to other cultures created a revolution in medieval European metallurgy. Local smiths who learned Norse techniques began producing weapons of dramatically improved quality, leading to an arms race that elevated the overall standard of weapon production across the continent. However, the original Viking weapons retained their edge in quality and effectiveness, suggesting that the full secrets of their manufacture were never completely transferred to foreign craftsmen. The economic impact of Viking weapon exports can be traced through contemporary trade records and archaeological evidence revealing a thriving international market for Norse arms. The premium prices commanded by Viking weapons in foreign markets provided significant wealth that funded further military expeditions and technological development. This economic success created a positive feedback loop that encouraged continued innovation and improvement in weapon design and manufacturing techniques. The ritual destruction of weapons found in bog deposits and sacrificial sites represents one of the most intriguing aspects of Viking weapon culture. The deliberate bending, breaking, and disposal of high-quality weapons suggests that their value extended far beyond mere monetary worth to encompass spiritual and symbolic dimensions that modern observers can barely comprehend. The scale of these weapon sacrifices, involving hundreds of swords, spears, and other arms, indicates the enormous wealth and resources that Viking society was willing to dedicate to religious and ceremonial purposes. The preservation of weapon-making knowledge through oral traditions and practical apprenticeships created a remarkably stable technological base that maintained consistent quality standards across centuries of production. Unlike written technical manuals that could be lost or corrupted, the hands-on training methods used by Viking smiths ensured that crucial knowledge was preserved in the muscle memory and intuitive understanding of successive generations of craftsmen. The testing of weapons was as rigorous as their creation. Blades were subjected to trials that would destroy inferior steel bent until they nearly touched their own points, then released to see if they would spring back true. They were used to cut through male leather and bone to ensure they would perform when lives depended on their effectiveness. Only weapons that passed these grueling tests were deemed worthy of carrying into battle, and even then a warrior would continue to test and maintain his weapons throughout his life. The adaptation of Viking weapons to different combat environments demonstrates the flexibility and responsiveness of Norse military technology. Weapons designed for use in the forests of Scandinavia were modified for desert warfare during expeditions to the Mediterranean, while those intended for naval combat were adapted for siege warfare when circumstances required. This adaptability was built into the fundamental design philosophy of Viking weapons, making them effective across a wide range of tactical situations. The psychological impact of Viking weapon quality on enemy morale cannot be quantified, but was undoubtedly significant. Opponents who faced Viking warriors knew they were confronting not just skilled fighters, but also superior weapons that could cut through their armor, penetrate their shields, and deliver wounds that were almost impossible to treat with medieval medical knowledge. This psychological advantage often proved as decisive as the physical superiority of the weapons themselves. The legacy of Viking weapon technology continued to influence European military development long after the end of the Viking Age, with many innovations first developed by Norse smiths becoming standard features of medieval weapons. The techniques for creating composite steel structures, the principles of differential hardening, and the methods for achieving optimal blade geometry all trace their origins back to Viking workshops, where these innovations were first perfected. The training systems that developed around Viking weapons created a warrior culture that valued technical excellence as much as raw courage, producing fighters who understood their weapons as thoroughly as they understood tactics and strategy. This comprehensive approach to military education created warriors who could adapt quickly to new situations and make the most effective use of their superior weapons in any combat scenario they might encounter. The culmination of Viking weapon technology reached its peak during the height of the Viking Age, when centuries of accumulated knowledge, refined techniques, and cultural dedication to martial excellence converged to produce weapons that were truly without equal in the medieval world. The master smiths of this period weren't just craftsmen, but artists, scientists, and engineers rolled into one, creating weapons that transcended their purely functional purpose to become objects of beauty, power, and almost mystical significance. The legendary weapons that emerged from this golden age of Viking metallurgy became the stuff of sagas and songs, their names echoing through history long after their wielders had passed into legend. Swords like Skofnung, said to be the sharpest and hardest of all weapons or gram, which could cut through an anvil as easily as silk, weren't just mythological constructs, but represented the very real pinnacle of what Viking weapon makers could achieve when skill, resources, and inspiration aligned perfectly. The international recognition of Viking weapon superiority reached such heights that foreign rulers actively sought to recruit Norse smiths to work in their own armories, offering enormous sums and prestigious positions to lure these master craftsmen away from their homeland. The brain drain that resulted from these recruitment efforts actually helped spread Viking techniques throughout Europe, but it also demonstrated the universal acknowledgement of Norse superiority in the art of weapon making. The scientific principles underlying Viking weapon construction, while not formally understood in modern terms, were intuitively grasped and applied with remarkable precision by master smiths who had spent decades perfecting their craft. The control of grain structure in steel, the manipulation of stress patterns through selective heat treatment, and the optimization of blade geometry for specific combat applications all required a deep understanding of materials science that wouldn't be formally codified until the Industrial Age. The testing protocols used to evaluate the finest Viking weapons were as rigorous as any modern quality assurance program, involving multiple stages of evaluation that assessed not just the weapon's basic functionality, but also its performance under extreme conditions. Master smiths would subject their finest creations to tests that would destroy lesser weapons, confident that truly superior construction would survive even the most demanding trials. The cultural significance of owning a weapon made by a legendary smith extended far beyond mere status symbol to encompass spiritual and magical dimensions that modern observers struggle to comprehend. These weapons weren't just tools, but talismans believed to carry within their steel the essence of their creator's skill and the accumulated power of all the battles they had witnessed. The bond between warrior and weapon became so strong that many Vikings preferred to die rather than surrender their arms to an enemy. The reputation of Viking weapons spread far beyond the borders of Scandinavia, carried by traders, raiders, and warriors who ventured into distant lands. From the monasteries of Ireland to the trading posts of Constantinople, people spoke in hushed tones about the legendary quality of Norse steel. The very sight of a Viking longship on the horizon was enough to strike fear into the hearts of coastal settlements, not just because of the fierce warriors aboard, but because of the devastating weapons they carried. The economic networks that supported the production of the finest Viking weapons were vast and complex, involving traders, miners, and craftsmen from across the known world. The best weapons required materials that might come from a dozen different sources: iron from Swedish bogs, silver from Arabic coins, amber from Baltic shores, and exotic hardwoods from distant forests. The coordination required to bring all these elements together in a single workshop represented a logistical achievement that rivaled the weapons themselves. The training required to master the use of these superior weapons was equally demanding, involving not just physical conditioning and technical skill, but also mental discipline and spiritual preparation. The most elite Viking warriors spent years learning to fight with weapons that were so perfectly balanced and responsive that they seemed to anticipate their wielder's intentions. The harmony between warrior and weapon that resulted from this intensive training created a fighting effectiveness that seemed almost supernatural to observers. The battlefield performance of Viking weapons in the hands of skilled warriors was nothing short of devastating, with historical accounts describing single warriors cutting through entire enemy formations like farmers harvesting grain. While such accounts might seem exaggerated, the archaeological evidence supports claims of extraordinary effectiveness, with mass graves from Viking battles showing wound patterns that could only have been inflicted by weapons of exceptional sharpness and precision. The preservation of Viking weapon-making traditions through the medieval period and beyond created a continuous thread of technological development that influenced European metallurgy for centuries. Even as political circumstances changed and the Viking Age came to an end, the techniques and principles developed by Norse smiths continued to evolve and improve, laying the foundation for later advances in steel production and weapon design. The psychological warfare aspects of Viking weapon superiority extended beyond the immediate battlefield to influence diplomatic negotiations, trade relationships, and political alliances throughout medieval Europe. The mere threat of facing Viking warriors armed with their legendary weapons was often enough to secure favorable terms in negotiations, while the promise of access to Viking weapons could cement political alliances and trading partnerships. The artistic achievements represented by the finest Viking weapons elevated them from mere tools of war to works of art that were treasured and displayed even when not needed for combat. The intricate patterns created by master smiths, the elegant proportions of perfectly balanced blades, and the sophisticated decoration applied to hilts and scabbards all demonstrated that Viking weapon makers understood beauty as well as functionality. The technological innovations that emerged from Viking weapon production had applications that extended far beyond military uses, influencing developments in agriculture, construction, and manufacturing that improved the quality of life throughout Scandinavian society. The precision manufacturing techniques, advanced metallurgy, and quality control systems developed for weapons production were adapted for civilian applications that benefited the entire population. The legacy of Viking weapon superiority continued to influence military thinking and weapon development long after the end of the Viking Age, with many of the principles first established by Norse smiths becoming fundamental aspects of weapon design that persist to this day. The emphasis on quality over quantity, the importance of superior materials and construction, and the integration of form and function all trace their origins back to the workshops where Viking weapons were forged. The final testament to Viking weapon superiority lies not in the written records or archaeological evidence, though both are compelling, but in the simple fact that these weapons continued to be prized, copied, and sought after for centuries after their creation. In a world where survival depended on the quality of one's arms, the enduring reputation of Viking weapons speaks to an excellence that transcended cultural boundaries and historical periods, establishing a standard of martial technology that has never been surpassed. The enduring mystery of Viking weapon superiority continues to fascinate modern researchers, military historians, and weapons enthusiasts who struggle to fully understand how medieval craftsmen achieved results that challenge even contemporary manufacturing capabilities. Despite advances in metallurgical science, computer modeling, and precision manufacturing, modern attempts to recreate the finest Viking weapons have consistently fallen short of matching the quality achieved by their ancient predecessors, suggesting that crucial knowledge was lost when the last master smiths took their secrets to the grave. The sword, while perhaps the most famous of Viking weapons, was just one instrument in an arsenal that had been refined over centuries of constant warfare. The seax, a single-edged knife that could range from a few inches to nearly sword length, was perhaps more common and in many ways more practical. Every Viking carried a seax, from the lowliest thrall to the mightiest jarl. It served as tool weapon and symbol of free status, all rolled into one elegant package. The seax was the Swiss army knife of the Viking world, equally at home cutting rope on a longship, preparing food around a campfire, or sliding between an enemy's ribs in the heat of battle. The holistic approach to weapon development that characterized Viking culture created a synergy between metallurgy design training and tactical application that has never been replicated in subsequent military traditions. While later periods might have excelled in individual aspects of weapon technology, none achieved the comprehensive integration of all elements that made Viking weapons so devastatingly effective. This integration wasn't accidental, but represented the culmination of a culture that placed martial excellence at the very center of its value system. The environmental factors that contributed to Viking weapon superiority extended beyond the obvious advantages of high-quality bog iron and abundant forests for charcoal production. The harsh Scandinavian climate that forged the Viking character also created ideal conditions for weapon testing and development, with extreme temperature variations, corrosive salt air, and demanding combat conditions that eliminated any weaknesses in design or construction. Weapons that could survive and perform in these conditions were ready for anything the world could throw at them. The social structures that supported Viking weapon development created a unique ecosystem where innovation was rewarded, excellence was demanded, and failure was literally a matter of life and death. The competitive nature of Viking society, combined with the constant threat of warfare, created evolutionary pressure that drove continuous improvement in weapon technology. Unlike modern military-industrial complexes that might prioritize cost-effectiveness or mass production, Viking weapon makers focused solely on creating the most effective tools possible, regardless of the time, effort, or resources required. The spiritual dimensions of Viking weapon culture added layers of meaning and motivation that transcended purely practical considerations, creating weapons that were imbued with cultural significance and personal identity. The belief that weapons possessed souls, that they could influence the outcome of battles through supernatural means, and that they served as bridges between the mortal and divine realms, motivated craftsmen to achieve levels of perfection that purely secular approaches might never have reached. The international impact of Viking weapons extended far beyond their immediate military applications to influence trade patterns, diplomatic relationships, and cultural exchanges throughout medieval Europe and beyond. The demand for Viking weapons created economic opportunities that funded exploration, colonization, and technological development, while the fear of Viking arms shaped military strategies and defensive preparations across the continent. The ripple effects of Viking weapon superiority touched virtually every aspect of medieval life. The technological principles embedded in Viking weapon design anticipated many developments that wouldn't be formally recognized by materials science for centuries. The use of composite construction, differential heat treatment, and stress optimization all demonstrated an intuitive understanding of engineering principles that modern science has only recently begun to fully appreciate. The fact that medieval craftsmen could achieve such sophisticated results without formal scientific training speaks to the power of accumulated experience and cultural knowledge. The training methodologies that developed around Viking weapons created educational systems that were remarkably effective at producing skilled warriors who could maximize the potential of their superior arms. The integration of physical conditioning, technical instruction, tactical training, and psychological preparation created a comprehensive approach to martial education that has influenced military training programs throughout history. The emphasis on individual excellence within a framework of collective action created warriors who were both formidable individual fighters and effective team members. The preservation of Viking weapon traditions through oral culture and practical apprenticeships created a remarkably stable knowledge base that maintained quality standards across generations of craftsmen. Unlike written technical manuals that could be lost, corrupted, or misinterpreted, the hands-on training methods used by Viking smiths ensured that crucial knowledge was preserved in the muscle memory and intuitive understanding of successive generations. This organic preservation system proved more durable than many formal educational institutions. The archaeological record continues to yield new insights into Viking weapon technology, with each discovery adding to our understanding of their manufacturing techniques, tactical applications, and cultural significance. The scientific analysis of weapon fragments using advanced techniques like electron microscopy, X-ray, crystallography, and chemical analysis has revealed construction details that were invisible to earlier researchers, confirming the sophistication of Viking metallurgy while raising new questions about how such results were achieved. The influence of Viking weapons on subsequent military developments can be traced through the evolution of European martial traditions, with many innovations first developed by Norse smiths becoming standard features of medieval and Renaissance weapons. The techniques for creating pattern-welded steel, the principles of differential hardening, and the methods for achieving optimal blade geometry all have their roots in Viking workshops, where these innovations were first perfected and refined. The craftsmanship that went into even the humblest sayax was remarkable. The blade would be forged with a hard steel edge welded to a softer iron core, creating a weapon that could hold a razor-sharp edge while remaining flexible enough to withstand the stresses of daily use. The handle, often made from antler bone or precious wood, was shaped to fit perfectly in the hand, with subtle curves and ridges that provided a secure grip even when slick with blood or seawater. The economic legacy of Viking weapon production created wealth and prosperity that funded the cultural achievements of the Viking Age, from the construction of magnificent longships to the creation of literary masterpieces that preserved Norse mythology and history for future generations. The profits from weapon exports provided the resources necessary for exploration, colonization, and cultural development that extended Viking influence far beyond their military conquests. The final assessment of Viking weapon superiority must acknowledge that their achievements represented more than just technological advancement, but rather a complete cultural commitment to martial excellence that permeated every aspect of society. The weapons themselves were merely the physical manifestation of a worldview that valued courage, skill, and honor above all else, creating tools that reflected the character and aspirations of the people who forged them. The legacy of Viking weapons continues to inspire modern craftsmen, military historians, and weapons enthusiasts who recognize in these ancient artifacts a standard of excellence that transcends historical periods and cultural boundaries. In an age of mass production and technological complexity, the Viking approach to weapon making offers lessons about the value of individual craftsmanship, attention to detail, and the pursuit of perfection that remain relevant today. The story of Viking weapons is ultimately the story of human potential, realized through dedication, skill, and cultural commitment to excellence. These remarkable tools of war stand as monuments to what can be achieved when talent, resources, and determination converge in pursuit of a common goal, creating artifacts that continue to inspire wonder and admiration more than 1,000 years after their creation. But it was the axe that truly captured the essence of Viking warfare. While other cultures might view the axe as a crude tool better suited for chopping wood than fighting battles, the Vikings elevated it to an art form. The bearded axe, with its distinctive curved blade that extended below the socket, was a masterpiece of functional design. The extended lower edge, or beard, allowed the wielder to hook an opponent's shield or weapon, pulling them off balance and creating openings for devastating follow-up attacks. The balance of a Viking war axe was crucial to its effectiveness. Too heavy, and it would tire the warrior's arm. Too light, and it would lack the momentum needed to cleave through armor and bone. Master craftsmen spent years learning to achieve the perfect weight distribution, often adding or removing material from the head until the weapon felt like a natural extension of the wielder's arm. The best axes seemed to move of their own accord, flowing through complex attack patterns with a grace that belied their deadly purpose. The psychological impact of Viking weapons cannot be understated. The sight of a berserker charging into battle with a massive two-handed axe, his eyes rolled back in religious ecstasy, was enough to break the morale of even veteran troops. These weapons weren't just tools of war, they were instruments of terror, designed to strike fear into the hearts of enemies before the first blow was struck. The very sound they made, cutting through the air, was distinctive, a whistling death song that announced the arrival of doom. Spears, too, held a special place in the Viking arsenal. While often overlooked in favor of more glamorous weapons, the spear was actually the most common weapon on any Viking battlefield. It was practical, effective, and relatively inexpensive to produce, making it accessible to warriors of all social classes. But calling a Viking spear simple would be a grave mistake. These weapons were marvels of engineering with carefully balanced heads that could punch through mail or slice through flesh with equal ease. The variety of spearheads available to Viking warriors was staggering. Some were broad and leaf-shaped, designed for slashing attacks that could open terrible wounds. Others were narrow and pointed, perfect for thrusting through gaps in armor or between the planks of a shield wall. The most prized spears featured wings or lugs just below the head, preventing the weapon from penetrating too deeply and becoming stuck in an opponent's body or shield. Viking weapons weren't merely tools of war, they were extensions of the soul companions that shared the burden of survival in a world where weakness meant death and strength meant everything. The relationship between a Viking warrior and his weapons was as sacred as marriage, as binding as blood oaths sworn under the northern lights. Each scratch, each nick in the blade, told a story of battles fought, enemies vanquished, and honor preserved in the face of overwhelming odds. The shafts of Viking spears were works of art in their own right. Crafted from carefully selected ashwood, they were shaped and seasoned to provide the perfect combination of strength and flexibility. The wood was often treated with oils and resins to protect it from the elements, and the finest spears featured intricate carvings or inlaid metals that marked them as weapons of status. A well-made spear shaft could last for decades, outliving multiple heads as they were damaged or lost in battle. The shield, while primarily defensive, was also an integral part of the Viking weapons system. These weren't the massive tower shields used by other cultures, but rather smaller, more maneuverable round shields that could be used offensively as well as defensively. The boss, the metal dome at the center of the shield, wasn't just decorative. It was a weapon in its own right, capable of delivering crushing blows that could shatter bones or cave in skulls. The construction of Viking shields reflected the same attention to detail found in their other weapons. The wooden planks were carefully selected and arranged to provide maximum strength while keeping weight to a minimum. The rim was often reinforced with leather or metal, preventing the shield from splitting when struck by heavy weapons. The grip and arm strap were positioned to allow for quick fluid movements that could transition seamlessly from defense to attack. But perhaps the most innovative aspect of Viking shield design was the way they were integrated into the overall weapons system. A skilled warrior could use his shield to bind an opponent's weapon while simultaneously launching a counterattack with his sword or axe. The shield became an extension of the warrior's body, moving in perfect harmony with his other weapons to create a deadly dance of steel and wood. The bow, while perhaps less celebrated than melee weapons, played a crucial role in Viking warfare. These weren't the massive longbows that would later dominate medieval battlefields, but rather shorter, more compact weapons that could be used effectively from the deck of a longship or in the confined spaces of a shield wall. The construction of Viking bows required incredible skill, with multiple layers of different woods laminated together to create a weapon that could store and release enormous amounts of energy. The arrows used with these bows were themselves marvels of precision engineering. Each arrow was carefully crafted to fly true, with fletching made from the finest feathers and heads forged from the same high-quality steel used in swords and axes. The variety of arrowheads available to Viking archers was impressive, ranging from broad hunting points, designed to bring down large game, to narrow bodkins that could punch through mail with devastating effect. Some arrows featured barbed heads that would lodge in an opponent's flesh, making removal difficult and ensuring that even a non-fatal wound could prove deadly through blood loss or infection. The process of making arrows was almost as complex as forging a sword. The shaft had to be perfectly straight and balanced, with the weight distributed precisely to ensure accurate flight. The nock, where the bowstring engaged the arrow, was carved with mathematical precision to provide a secure fit without binding. Even the fletching was applied with careful attention to detail, with each feather positioned to impart the exact amount of spin needed for stability in flight. Viking archers weren't just skilled marksmen, they were tacticians who understood how to use their weapons to maximum effect in battle. They could rain down arrows on enemy formations from long-range, disrupting charges and weakening shield walls before the main assault began. In naval combat, archers positioned in the bow and stern of longships could sweep the decks of enemy vessels, clearing the way for boarding parties armed with close combat weapons. The crossbow, while not as commonly associated with Viking warfare as other weapons, did make appearances in later Viking conflicts. These weapons represented the cutting edge of military technology, capable of penetrating armor that would turn aside arrows from conventional bows. The mechanical advantage provided by the crossbow's trigger mechanism meant that even relatively untrained warriors could deliver devastating shots with accuracy that would take years to develop with a traditional bow. But it was in the realm of siege warfare that Viking weapons truly demonstrated their versatility and innovation. The Vikings weren't just raiders who struck coastal settlements and disappeared. They were also capable of conducting complex siege operations against fortified positions. Their weapons had to be adaptable enough to function in these varied combat environments, and Viking craftsmen rose to the challenge with typical ingenuity. The craftsmanship that went into creating these instruments of war was nothing short of extraordinary. While the rest of Europe stumbled through what historians would later call the Dark Ages, Viking smiths were pushing the boundaries of metallurgy to heights that wouldn't be matched for centuries. They understood secrets of steel that had been lost to time, techniques passed down through whispered conversations in smoky forges, where the only light came from the dancing flames that transformed raw iron into legendary weapons. The warhammer, while less common than swords or axes, was a specialized weapon designed specifically for dealing with heavily armored opponents. The concentrated force delivered by the hammer's small striking surface could cave in helmets, crush mail links, and shatter bones, even through layers of protection. The backspike found on many warhammers could punch through armor like a can opener, creating wounds that were almost impossible to treat with medieval medical knowledge. The construction of warhammers required a different set of skills than other weapons. The head had to be perfectly balanced to deliver maximum force while remaining controllable in the wielder's hands. The striking surface needed to be hard enough to crush armor without chipping or deforming, while the handle had to absorb the tremendous shock of impact without breaking. The best warhammers were works of art with intricate engravings and inlays that marked them as weapons of the elite. Maces, too, found their place in the Viking arsenal, particularly among warriors who faced heavily armored opponents. These weapons relied on blunt force trauma rather than cutting edges, making them ideal for dealing with enemies protected by mail or scale armor. The flanged mace, with its projecting ridges, could concentrate force into smaller areas, while the flanges helped prevent the weapon from sliding off rounded surfaces like helmets or shields. The psychological warfare aspect of Viking weapons extended beyond their mere appearance. Many weapons were inscribed with runes that were believed to imbue them with magical properties. These weren't just decorative elements, they were integral parts of the weapon's identity, connecting it to the spiritual realm and the favor of the gods. A sword inscribed with runes for victory and protection wasn't just a tool of war, it was a talisman that carried the hopes and beliefs of its wielder into battle. The naming of weapons was another aspect of this spiritual connection. Swords like Grambalmung and Turfing weren't just pieces of metal. They were legendary entities with their own personalities and destinies. The act of naming a weapon created a bond between warrior and blade that transcended the merely physical, establishing a relationship that could last for generations as the weapon passed from father to son. The maintenance and care of weapons was a ritual in itself, performed with the same reverence that others might reserve for religious ceremonies. Warriors would spend hours cleaning, sharpening, and oiling their weapons, not just to maintain their effectiveness, but to honor the spirits that dwelt within the steel. The whetstones used for sharpening were often imported from distant lands, chosen for their specific properties and ability to produce the finest edges. The testing of weapons before battle was another crucial ritual. Warriors would perform practice cuts on various materials, testing the edge and balance of their weapons, while also preparing their minds for the violence to come. These weren't casual exercises, they were serious evaluations that could mean the difference between life and death when the real fighting began. A warrior who discovered a flaw in his weapon during these tests had time to make repairs or select a backup weapon. One who discovered such a flaw in the middle of battle might not live to regret the oversight. The social hierarchy of Viking society was reflected in the quality and ornamentation of weapons. A jarl's sword might feature a pommel of silver or gold with intricate knotwork patterns that demonstrated both the owner's wealth and the craftsman's skill. The scabbard would be equally elaborate, made from the finest leather and decorated with precious metals and gems. In contrast, a common warrior's weapon might be simpler in appearance, but no less deadly in function, proving that Viking weapon-making excellence extended across all social classes. The trading networks that supplied materials for Viking weapons stretched across the known world. Amber from the Baltic shores was traded for steel from the Frankish kingdoms. Walrus ivory from the Arctic was exchanged for silver from the Islamic world. These trade routes weren't just commercial enterprises, they were the arteries that fed the Viking war machine, bringing together the finest materials from across Europe and beyond to create weapons that would dominate battlefields for centuries. The influence of Viking weapons extended far beyond their immediate military applications. The techniques developed by Norse smiths influenced weapon-making traditions across Europe, with craftsmen in other cultures adopting and adapting Viking innovations. The pattern welding technique, for example, spread throughout the medieval world, becoming a hallmark of high-quality blade construction that persisted long after the Viking Age had ended. Pattern welding was perhaps the most remarkable of these techniques, a process so complex and time-consuming that only the most skilled craftsmen dared attempt it. The smith would take multiple strips of iron and steel, each with different carbon contents, and twist them together like braiding a maiden's hair. The resulting pattern, when etched with acid, revealed swirling designs that looked like flowing water or serpentine creatures writhing along the blade's surface. These weren't mere decorations. They were proof of the weapon's superior construction, a visual testament to the countless hours of labor that had gone into its creation. The evolution of Viking weapons technology didn't happen in isolation, but was driven by the constant pressure of warfare and the need to stay ahead of their enemies. As other cultures developed new armor and defensive techniques, Viking smiths responded with innovations that could overcome these challenges. This arms race pushed the boundaries of what was possible with medieval metallurgy, creating weapons that were generations ahead of their time. The development of specialized anti-armor weapons became particularly important as the Vikings encountered increasingly well-protected opponents during their raids and conquests. The mail-piercing dagger with its narrow reinforced point was designed specifically to slip between the links of chainmail or find gaps in plate armor. These weapons required incredible precision in their manufacture, with points that had to be hard enough to penetrate metal while remaining sharp enough to slide through the smallest openings. The technique of quenching, where red-hot steel was rapidly cooled in water, oil, or even urine, was refined to an art form by Viking smiths. Different quenching media produced different results, and master craftsmen guarded their secret formulas jealously. Some smiths claimed that quenching a blade in the blood of a fallen enemy would imbue it with supernatural sharpness, while others insisted that only spring water collected under a full moon would produce the finest edge. While these beliefs might seem superstitious today, they reflected a deep understanding of how different cooling rates and chemical compositions affected the final properties of the steel. The tempering process that followed quenching was equally crucial and required even more skill to execute properly. The smith would carefully reheat the blade to specific temperatures, judging the heat by the color of the steel as it glowed in the forge. Too little heat, and the blade would remain brittle. Too much, and it would become soft and unable to hold an edge. The perfect temper produced a blade that was hard enough to cut through bone, yet flexible enough to bend without breaking, a combination that seemed almost magical to those who didn't understand the science behind it. The handles and grips of Viking weapons were marvels of ergonomic design, shaped to fit the human hand with a precision that modern manufacturers would envy. The pommel of a sword wasn't just a counterweight. It was carefully calculated to balance the blade and provide the perfect point of equilibrium for the weapon's intended use. A sword, designed for thrusting, would have a different balance point than one intended for cutting, and the pommel would be adjusted accordingly. The crossguards of Viking swords served multiple purposes beyond simply protecting the wielder's hand. They could be used to trap an opponent's blade, creating opportunities for counterattacks, or as striking weapons in their own right during close-quarters combat. The most elaborate crossguards featured intricate decorations that served as status symbols while also providing practical advantages in combat. The scabbards that protected these precious weapons were works of art in themselves. Made from wood covered in leather and often decorated with metal fittings, they were designed to protect the blade while allowing for quick, smooth draws in combat situations. The throat of the scabbard where the blade entered was often reinforced with metal to prevent wear from repeated sheathing and drawing. Some scabbards featured elaborate suspension systems that allowed the weapon to be worn in different positions depending on the situation. The maintenance of weapons in the field was a constant concern for Viking warriors. Campaign conditions were harsh, with weapons exposed to salt spray rain and the corrosive effects of blood and other bodily fluids. Warriors carried small repair kits that included whetstones, oil, and basic tools for making field repairs. The ability to maintain one's weapons in fighting condition could mean the difference between victory and defeat, life and death. The role of weapons in Viking religious practices extended beyond simple blessing ceremonies. Weapons were often sacrificed to the gods, thrown into bogs or lakes as offerings to ensure victory in upcoming battles. Archaeological evidence suggests that these weren't worn-out or damaged weapons.
but rather some of the finest examples of the smith's art deliberately destroyed as gifts to the divine realm. The famous weapon deposits found in Danish bogs contain hundreds of swords, spears, and shields, many of them bent or broken in ritual destruction.
The training required to master Viking weapons was intensive and began at an early age. Young boys would start with wooden practice weapons, learning the basic movements and techniques that would later be applied with steel. The training wasn't just about physical technique. It also included the mental discipline required to remain calm and focused in the chaos of battle. A warrior who panicked and forgot his training was as good as dead, regardless of how fine his weapons might be. But the Vikings didn't stop at making their weapons beautiful. They made them deadly beyond imagination. The process of differential hardening meant that a single blade could have multiple zones of varying hardness. The edge would be hard enough to cut through mail and bone, while the spine remained flexible enough to absorb the shock of impact without shattering. This wasn't accidental. It was the result of generations of accumulated knowledge passed down from master to apprentice in an unbroken chain that stretched back to the very dawn of the Viking Age. The concept of weapon schools where master warriors would teach their techniques to paying students was well established in Viking society. These weren't formal institutions, but rather informal networks of knowledge that passed fighting techniques from generation to generation. The most famous weapon masters had students who traveled from across Scandinavia to learn their secrets, creating a standardization of technique that made Viking warriors formidable opponents regardless of which region they came from. The economics of weapon ownership created interesting social dynamics within Viking society. A fine sword might cost as much as several farms, making it accessible only to the wealthy elite. However, the communal nature of Viking warfare meant that weapons were often shared or loaned to worthy warriors who couldn't afford their own. A jarl might arm his entire retinue with weapons from his personal armory, creating bonds of loyalty that went beyond simple employment relationships. The inheritance of weapons was governed by complex social customs that varied from region to region. In some areas, weapons automatically passed to the eldest son, while in others they might be distributed among all male heirs, or even given to the most worthy warrior, regardless of family relationship. These customs reflected the deep cultural significance of weapons in Viking society and their role as symbols of honor, status, and martial prowess. The repair and modification of weapons was a specialized skill that required different techniques than original manufacture. Battle damage had to be assessed and corrected without compromising the weapon's structural integrity. A skilled repairsmith could take a damaged blade and restore it to full functionality, sometimes even improving upon the original design. The most challenging repairs involved pattern-welded blades where damage to the complex steel structure required careful analysis and precise welding techniques. The metallurgical advances achieved by Viking smiths represented a quantum leap in weapon technology that wouldn't be matched in Europe for centuries. Their understanding of iron and steel chemistry was intuitive rather than scientific, but no less effective for being based on generations of accumulated experience rather than formal theory. The ability to control carbon content in steel, to manipulate the grain structure through careful heating and cooling cycles, and to create composite materials that combined the best properties of different metals was knowledge that had been hard-won through countless hours at the forge. The crucible steel techniques that some Viking smiths employed were closely guarded secrets passed down through family lines like precious heirlooms. These methods allowed for the creation of steel with uniform carbon distribution and exceptional purity, free from the slag inclusions and inconsistencies that plagued lesser weapons. The resulting blades could achieve levels of hardness and sharpness that seemed impossible to those unfamiliar with the techniques involved. The concept of differential hardening, where different parts of the same blade were heat-treated to achieve different properties, was perhaps the most sophisticated metallurgical technique in the Viking arsenal. A sword blade might have a hard, sharp edge for cutting, a softer spine for flexibility, and intermediate zones that provided smooth transitions between these different regions. This wasn't achieved through guesswork, but through precise control of temperature timing and cooling rates that required years of experience to master. The use of specialized tools in weapon manufacture was another area where Viking smiths excelled. Their hammers weren't crude implements, but precisely balanced tools designed for specific tasks. Different hammers were used for drawing out the steel, for shaping curves, for creating textures, and for the final finishing work that gave weapons their distinctive appearance. The anvils used by mastersmiths were works of art in themselves, with specialized features like Horn's Pritchell holes and Hardy holes that allowed for complex shaping operations. The forge itself was a carefully designed system that could achieve and maintain the exact temperatures needed for different stages of weapon production. The bellows that supplied air to the fire were often operated by assistants who had to maintain steady, rhythmic pumping for hours at a time. The fuel used in the forge was selected for its burning characteristics, with charcoal being preferred for its clean, hot flame that didn't introduce impurities into the steel. The social structure surrounding weapon production created a hierarchy of craftsmen that reflected the complexity and importance of their work. At the top were the master smiths, revered figures who commanded respect throughout Viking society. Below them were journeymen who had mastered the basic techniques but lacked the experience and reputation of the masters. Apprentices formed the bottom-tier young men who spent years learning the fundamentals of the craft while performing the menial tasks that kept the forge running. The materials themselves were often as legendary as the weapons they became. Iron bog ore extracted from the marshes and wetlands of Scandinavia contained unique properties that made it ideal for weapon making. The Vikings learned to recognize the telltale signs of high-quality ore, knowing that the difference between good iron and great iron could mean the difference between life and death in battle. They would travel vast distances to secure the best materials, trading precious amber and furs for steel ingots that had been forged in the workshops of the Frankish Empire or the distant lands of the Rus. The apprenticeship system ensured that knowledge was preserved and passed down through generations, but it also meant that innovation was often slow and incremental. A young smith might spend a decade learning traditional techniques before being allowed to experiment with new methods. This conservative approach helped maintain quality standards, but also meant that revolutionary advances were rare and precious when they did occur. The guild system that governed weapon production in many Viking communities created both opportunities and constraints for craftsmen. Guild membership provided protection, guaranteed markets, and access to the best materials, but it also imposed strict rules about techniques, pricing, and the training of new smiths. The most successful smiths learned to work within these constraints while still finding ways to distinguish their work from that of their competitors. The international nature of the Viking world meant that weapon-making techniques were constantly being exchanged and refined through contact with other cultures. A smith who traveled with a raiding expedition might encounter new methods in the workshops of captured territories, bringing these innovations back to his homeland where they could be adapted and improved. This cross-pollination of ideas helped drive the rapid advancement of Viking weapon technology during the height of the Viking Age. The standardization of weapon types across the Viking world was remarkable, given the decentralized nature of production. A sword made in Norway would be immediately recognizable to a warrior from Denmark or Iceland, not just in its basic form, but in its proportions, balance, and construction details. This standardization was achieved not through formal regulations, but through the shared cultural values and training methods that connected Viking smiths across vast distances. The testing protocols used to evaluate new weapons were as rigorous as any modern quality control system. Blades were subjected to cutting tests against various materials, from soft targets like cloth and leather to hard ones like mail and bone. Flexibility tests involved bending the blade to extreme angles and releasing it to see if it would return to true. Impact tests simulated the shock of combat, ensuring that weapons wouldn't fail at the moment when a warrior's life depended on their reliability. The documentation of weapon performance, while not formal in the modern sense, was preserved through oral traditions and sagas that recorded the deeds of famous weapons and their wielders. These stories served as both entertainment and technical manuals, preserving information about which weapons performed best in specific situations and under particular conditions. A warrior choosing a new weapon could draw on this accumulated wisdom to make informed decisions about what type of blade would best suit his fighting style and anticipated opponents. The customization of weapons for individual warriors was another area where Viking smiths excelled. A weapon wasn't just manufactured to generic specifications, but was tailored to fit the specific needs, preferences, and physical characteristics of its intended user. The length of the blade, the weight of the pommel, the curve of the grip, and dozens of other details were adjusted to create a weapon that was perfectly suited to its owner. The psychological aspects of weapon ownership went far beyond mere superstition. The bond between warrior and weapon was cultivated through ritual and ceremony, creating a relationship that enhanced performance in combat. A warrior who believed his sword was blessed by the gods and imbued with the spirits of his ancestors fought with a confidence and ferocity that could tip the balance in close encounters. The evolution of combat techniques drove corresponding changes in weapon design, creating a feedback loop that constantly pushed both areas forward. As warriors developed new fighting methods, smiths had to adapt their designs to support these innovations. Conversely, new weapon capabilities opened up tactical possibilities that hadn't existed before, leading to the development of new combat techniques that maximized the potential of these advanced tools. The tactical applications of Viking weapons in actual combat situations revealed their true superiority over the arms used by other contemporary cultures. The versatility of Viking weapons systems allowed warriors to adapt quickly to changing battlefield conditions, switching between offensive and defensive postures with fluid grace that often caught opponents off guard. This adaptability was built into the weapons themselves, with designs that supported multiple fighting techniques and could be employed effectively in various combat scenarios. Some weapons carried with them stories that transcended the merely mortal realm. Gram, the sword of Sigurd the Dragonslayer, was said to have been reforged from the shattered pieces of his father's blade by the dwarf Regan. When completed, it was so sharp that Sigurd could slice through an anvil as easily as cutting through silk. While such tales might seem like mere fantasy, they reflected a very real truth about Viking weapon making. These craftsmen were creating tools that seemed to possess almost supernatural qualities. The shield wall, perhaps the most famous Viking tactical formation, was perfectly suited to the weapons they carried. The round shields provided protection while allowing warriors to strike over, under, or around them with spears, axes, and swords. The overlapping shields created a mobile fortress that could advance steadily across the battlefield, with weapons bristling from every gap like the spines of some great hedgehog. The coordination required to maintain an effective shield wall while simultaneously launching attacks required not just individual skill but collective training that bound warriors together into a single deadly organism. The berserker phenomenon, while often misunderstood as simple battle rage, was actually a sophisticated psychological and tactical system that maximized the effectiveness of Viking weapons. These elite warriors didn't simply charge blindly into battle, but rather channeled their altered states of consciousness to achieve superhuman levels of focus and aggression. Their weapons became extensions of their transformed selves, moving with a speed and precision that seemed to transcend normal human limitations. The naval combat applications of Viking weapons were equally impressive, with designs specifically adapted for fighting on the cramped, unstable decks of longships. The shorter axes and swords used in ship-to-ship combat were balanced differently than their land-based counterparts, with modifications that accounted for the rolling motion of vessels and the need to fight in close quarters. Grappling hooks and boarding axes were specialized tools that combined weapon and utility functions, allowing warriors to secure enemy ships while simultaneously engaging in combat. The siege warfare capabilities of Viking weapons were often overlooked by historians who focused on their raiding activities, but archaeological evidence suggests that Vikings were capable of conducting sophisticated siege operations against fortified positions. Their weapons had to be adaptable enough to function in these specialized environments where traditional battlefield tactics might not apply. The ability to scale walls, fight in narrow passages, and overcome defensive obstacles required weapons that could perform multiple functions while remaining effective in their primary combat role. The logistics of weapon maintenance during extended campaigns presented unique challenges that Viking smiths had to address through innovative design solutions. Weapons needed to remain functional despite exposure to harsh weather conditions, corrosive salt air, and the wear and tear of constant use. The The materials and construction techniques used in Viking weapons were selected not just for their combat effectiveness, but also for their durability and ease of maintenance in field conditions. The training regimens used to develop proficiency with Viking weapons were as sophisticated as the weapons themselves. Warriors didn't just learn to swing a sword or thrust a spear, they mastered complete fighting systems that integrated multiple weapons with footwork, timing, and tactical awareness. The muscle memory developed through thousands of repetitions allowed experienced warriors to react instinctively in combat situations, their weapons moving in practiced patterns that had been honed through years of dedicated training. The role of women in Viking weapon culture was more significant than many realize, with archaeological evidence suggesting that some women were not only familiar with weapons, but actively participated in their manufacture and use. The legendary shield maidens weren't just mythological figures, but represented a real tradition of female warriors who wielded the same high-quality weapons as their male counterparts. The inclusion of weapons in female graves indicates that martial prowess was valued regardless of gender in Viking society. The ceremonial aspects of weapon use extended beyond religious rituals to include important social functions like oath-taking, legal proceedings, and diplomatic negotiations. Weapons weren't just tools of war, but symbols of authority, honor, and social status that played crucial roles in the complex political relationships that governed Viking society. The quality and ornamentation of a leader's weapons spoke to his wealth, power, and connections, serving as visual representations of his position in the social hierarchy. The international trade networks that supplied materials for Viking weapons created economic relationships that extended far beyond Scandinavia. The demand for high-quality steel, precious metals, and exotic materials drove commerce across vast distances, with Viking traders establishing routes that connected the Arctic with the Mediterranean, the Atlantic with the Black Sea. These trade relationships weren't just commercial ventures, but strategic alliances that provided access to the resources needed to maintain Viking military superiority. The technological innovations developed for weapon production had applications that extended far beyond military uses. The metallurgical techniques perfected by weaponsmiths were adapted for creating tools, agricultural implements, and household items that improved the quality of life for ordinary Vikings. The precision manufacturing methods developed for weapons production influenced other crafts, raising the overall level of technological sophistication throughout Viking society. The social significance of weapons in Viking society cannot be overstated. A man's sword was often given a name, treated as a member of the family, and passed down through generations like a precious heirloom. Weapons were buried with their owners, ensuring that the warrior would be properly armed in the afterlife. The quality of a man's weapons spoke to his status, his wealth, and his prowess in battle. A Viking without proper weapons was like a ship without sails adrift in a world that showed no mercy to the unprepared. The preservation of weapons through burial practices has provided modern archaeologists with an unprecedented window into Viking military technology. The weapons found in graves weren't just random selections, but carefully chosen items that reflected the deceased's status, achievements, and expectations for the afterlife. The condition of these weapons, many of which were deliberately damaged or killed before burial, provides insights into the spiritual beliefs that surrounded weapon ownership and use. The regional variations in Viking weapon styles reflected local preferences, available materials, and tactical requirements that varied across the vast territories inhabited by Norse peoples. A weapon that was perfectly suited for the forests of Sweden might be less effective in the open plains of Russia or the rocky coasts of Iceland. These regional adaptations demonstrate the flexibility and responsiveness of Viking weapon-making traditions to local conditions and requirements. The influence of Viking weapons on the development of medieval European martial arts cannot be overstated. The fighting techniques developed to maximize the effectiveness of Viking weapons spread throughout Europe through conquest, trade, and cultural exchange. Many of the fundamental principles of medieval swordsmanship can be traced back to innovations first developed by Viking warriors and weapon masters. The economic impact of weapon production on Viking society was enormous, with entire communities organized around the needs of smiths and warriors. The most successful weapon-making centers became wealthy and powerful, attracting the best craftsmen and commanding premium prices for their products. The concentration of wealth and expertise in these centers created positive feedback loops that drove further innovation and improvement in weapon technology. The psychological warfare aspects of Viking weapons extended far beyond their physical capabilities, creating a complex system of intimidation and terror that often won battles before they even began. The very sight of a Viking warband approaching their weapons, gleaming in the sunlight, and their shields painted with fearsome designs was enough to break the morale of many opponents. This psychological impact was carefully cultivated through the design and decoration of weapons, with many featuring intricate patterns, runic inscriptions, and symbolic elements that conveyed messages of power and divine favor. The sound of Viking weapons in combat was itself a weapon of psychological warfare. The distinctive ring of steel on steel, the whistle of arrows through the air, and the thunderous crash of axes against shields created an auditory landscape of terror that could unnerve even experienced warriors. Viking smiths understood this psychological dimension and deliberately crafted weapons that would produce the most intimidating sounds possible, with blade geometries and material choices that enhanced the acoustic properties of their creations. The ritual preparation of weapons before battle was as important as their physical maintenance, involving ceremonies that connected the warrior to his ancestors, his gods, and his destiny. These rituals weren't mere superstition, but sophisticated psychological techniques that prepared the mind for the violence to come. A warrior who had properly prepared his weapons and himself through ritual was entering battle with confidence, focus, and spiritual support that could make the difference between victory and defeat. The storytelling traditions that surrounded famous weapons created a mythology that enhanced their effectiveness in combat. When a warrior carried a blade that was said to have belonged to a legendary hero or to have been blessed by the gods themselves, he fought with the accumulated power of all those stories. The weapon became more than just a tool. It became a conduit for the heroic traditions of his people, a tangible connection to the glorious past and the promise of eternal fame. The apprenticeship system that governed weapon training created bonds between master and student that lasted for life, forming networks of loyalty and obligation that strengthened Viking society as a whole. A warrior who had been trained by a famous weapon master carried not just the technical skills he had learned, but also the reputation and connections of his teacher. These relationships created informal hierarchies of respect and authority that complemented the formal political structures of Viking society. The seasonal cycles of weapon production reflected the agricultural rhythms that governed Viking life, with the most intensive smithing work taking place during the winter months when farming activities were suspended. This seasonal pattern allowed smiths to dedicate their full attention to weapon making during the months when warriors were most likely to be planning raids and campaigns for the coming spring. The timing of weapon production was carefully coordinated with military activities to ensure that new weapons would be ready when they were needed most. The economics of weapon production created entire industries around the craft. Master smiths became wealthy and respected members of society, their services sought after by kings and jarls who understood that superior weapons could tip the balance of any conflict. The most famous smiths had their own distinctive styles, their work recognizable to those who knew what to look for. A blade forged by a master craftsman was worth more than most men would see in a lifetime, and the waiting list for such weapons could stretch for years. The quality control systems used in Viking weapon production were remarkably sophisticated, involving multiple stages of inspection and testing that ensured only the finest weapons reached the hands of warriors. Each stage of production was overseen by experienced craftsmen who could identify potential problems before they became serious flaws. The reputation of a smith depended on the consistent quality of his work, and the competitive nature of the craft drove continuous improvements in manufacturing techniques and quality standards. The international reputation of Viking weapons created demand that extended far beyond Scandinavia, with wealthy customers from across Europe seeking to acquire these legendary tools of war. The export of Viking weapons became a significant source of wealth for Scandinavian communities, with the most skilled smiths commanding prices that reflected the premium quality of their products. This international trade also facilitated the exchange of ideas and techniques as Viking smiths learned from foreign customers and incorporated new innovations into their traditional methods. The standardization of weapon specifications across the Viking world was achieved through informal networks of communication that connected smiths and warriors across vast distances. Travelers, traders, and raiders carried information about successful weapon designs and combat techniques, spreading innovations throughout the Norse world with remarkable speed. This informal standardization process ensured that Viking weapons maintained their effectiveness and reputation regardless of where they were manufactured. The environmental factors that influenced weapon design included not just the immediate combat environment, but also the broader climatic and geographical conditions of Scandinavia. Weapons had to function reliably in extreme cold, resist corrosion from salt air, and maintain their edge despite the abrasive effects of ice and snow. These environmental challenges drove innovations in metallurgy and design that made Viking weapons more durable and reliable than those produced in more temperate climates. The social mobility that weapon mastery could provide was one of the most attractive aspects of Viking military culture. A skilled warrior with superior weapons could rise from humble origins to positions of wealth and power, earning fame and fortune through his prowess in battle. This meritocratic aspect of Viking society encouraged excellence in weapon training and created incentives for continuous improvement in both individual skills and weapon technology. The defensive applications of Viking weapons were as sophisticated as their offensive capabilities, with many weapons designed to serve dual roles as both attacking tools and protective devices. The bearded axe, for example, could be used to hook and control an opponent's weapon while simultaneously delivering devastating counterattacks. This versatility reduced the number of weapons a warrior needed to carry while increasing his tactical options in combat. The maintenance schedules followed by Viking warriors were based on practical experience gained through generations of combat with specific procedures for different types of weapons and combat conditions. A sword used in naval combat required different maintenance than one used primarily on land, and warriors learned to adjust their care routines accordingly. The ability to properly maintain weapons in the field was considered as important as the ability to use them effectively in combat. The symbolic significance of weapon ownership extended beyond personal status to encompass family honor, clan identity, and cultural continuity. A weapon that had been passed down through generations carried with it the accumulated honor of all its previous owners, creating a tangible link between past and present that reinforced social bonds and cultural values. The loss or destruction of such a weapon was considered a catastrophe that could affect not just the individual warrior but his entire lineage. The technological innovations that emerged from Viking weapon production had implications that extended far beyond military applications, influencing developments in agriculture, construction, and other civilian industries. The precision manufacturing techniques developed for weapons were adapted for creating tools and implements that improved productivity and quality of life throughout Viking society. The metallurgical advances achieved by weaponsmiths laid the foundation for later developments in engineering and technology that would transform medieval Europe. The archaeological evidence for Viking weapon superiority is overwhelming, with excavated battlefields revealing the devastating effectiveness of Norse arms against contemporary opponents. The bone trauma patterns found in skeletal remains from Viking Age conflicts show distinctive damage signatures that can be directly attributed to specific weapon types, providing concrete proof of their lethal capabilities. The precision of cuts made by Viking swords, the crushing force delivered by their warhammers, and the penetrating power of their spears left unmistakable marks on the bones of their victims, creating a forensic record of their weapons' effectiveness.